in the newsletter in terms of your own publications coming out, articles, books, events that you're hosting, regional conferences, workshops, so on and so forth, as well as a discount off the next conference, set of conference fees, right? So there'll be that as well. And of course, you'll get early notification of WERN events, and you'll be on our listserv. And again, we won't really be bombarding you with emails. That's not our style, right? Except around, they cluster around conferences, typically. If you're unable to become a member right now, for financial or other reasons, and you still want to support the network, we would like to ask you to purchase the book from us, because that gives us the benefits that instead of, say, Amazon or anyone else. And when I say the book, I mean the issue of the journal, because it's a book, right? It's a journal that is a book. It's an annual journal. And so if you want to do that, you can pre-order the first issue from us here at the conference, or I'm going to send out an email to everyone probably the first week of August, because I've been a little busy and I haven't been able to get all that up there. So do be looking for that email, and if you're interested, we would really love your support and of course the continued involvement and engagement and all of these ideas, and this is one of the ways that we can continue to make that happen year after year. We're so excited that this third annual conference is, it really is still just very much the beginning, and there's no sign of stopping. So I thank you very much. Questions, of course, we can talk about at dinner, which will be in the great room again. Okay? All right, thank you. So let us get started with our final closing plenary. Wendy Matsumura from the University of California in San Diego will be giving her presentation, The Post-World War I Formation of the Autarkic Regional Sugar Economy and the Reconfiguration of the Boundaries of Domestic Agriculture. Jason W. Moore, Binghamton University, will be presenting on the four dualisms: stealth Malthusianism, peak liberalism, and the tasks of a revolutionary ecology. So, let's get started.
Thank you very much to Diana and to Jason and the organizing committee for letting me take part in this conversation. And I'd like to talk today, can you hear me? Because I tend to get a little soft. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'd like to talk today about some of the changes that took place in the Japanese sugar industry during and after World War I through the lens of an area that I study extensively, Okinawa. So as many of you may know, or those of you who study the sugar industry will know, this is a period that scholars who study the industry consistently point to as an epochal moment, especially with regards to the commodities' place within the global economy. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in addition to that, for Okinawa, I think it's important because I think that examining the transformation of the people of Okinawa into conditional national subjects under the pre-war empire has to be understood. So this prehistory needs to be understood in order to make sense of its current predicament, or the depth of its current predicament, in which Okinawa today contains 70% of all US military bases and related facilities on Japan. So it's a hyper-militarized space that's oftentimes analyzed with regards to kind of its Japan's geopolitical relationship with the United States. But what I am sort of suggesting is that it's really necessary to understand this earlier history and in something that seems unrelated, which is agricultural production, in order to really make sense of how this how I guess we can have the case where despite fierce opposition, despite continuous kind of referendums saying no to the military bases, they continue to exist, and there's no kind of political will on the part of the Japanese government to remove them. So before I get to sort of the specifics of this talk, I wanted to briefly introduce the history of Okinawa's emergence. So before Okinawa was Okinawa, it was Ryukyu. an autonomous kingdom with robust commercial and cultural ties to the continent and to Southeast Asia. The territory called Okinawa emerged through a process called Ryukyu Shogun, or the disposition or disposal of Ryukyu, which took place between 1872 and 1879. And during these 7 very chaotic years, the Meiji state, the Japanese state at the time, annexed the kingdom, converted it into a feudal domain of Japan, abolished that, renamed the region Okinawa, and welcomed it into the boundaries of the Japanese nation state as almost a full-fledged prefecture of Japan. And so even though Okinawa was incorporated into Japan, not as a colony, but as its prefecture, it was welcomed into the national space in a completely different way than the other territories that today constitute Japan. The state restaged old systems, relations, and hierarchies in Okinawa as the very method of its inclusion into the national space through a policy that it called the preservation of old customs. This policy granted concessions to key players of the old regime, including the deposed king, whose cooperation was necessary for a smooth takeover of control. And so while this policy selectively maintained existing standards, administrative systems, and institutions of the past, the region's incorporation into a new economic, political, and cultural system gave the customary and entirely new significance. Okinawa's cultivators remained direct producers who received periodic redistributions of farmland. They also paid taxes to local officials in labor, in kind, and in currency, just as they did during the kingdom period, but they became integrated into the Japanese commodity economy, which immediately heightened their vulnerability to external market fluctuations. The Meiji state encouraged them to direct their energies into producing sugar, which had spread during the early modern period as a form of tribute to the kingdom government. The new state encouraged this beginning in the early 1880s in order to alleviate the country's balance of trade deficit. So 1/3 of the entire country's exports was comprised at the time of sugar and cotton, and this was seen as a way, or Okinawa's inclusion into the national space was seen as a way to alleviate some of these deficits. So by the time the preservation of old customs policy was abolished in Okinawa in 1903, the foundations had been laid for the transformation of the former kingdom into the Japanese nation state's internal periphery as a sugar monoculture. Mainland Japanese capital entered Okinawa, aided by the government's provisioning of large swaths of land to those committed to turning, quote, idle lands productive. The government also nationalized formerly royal lands and rich forest lands that had been utilized by local communities in order to develop a lumber industry. The first Japanese sugar companies entered Okinawa in full force on the eve of World War I. They came into the prefecture, determined to spread the production of centrifugal sugar, and the 2 kind of mainland sugar companies that entered Okinawa, called the Okitai Seijo and the Tainatsu, they're actually very minor in the history of the Japanese sugar empire, but these are the 2 to enter Okinawa in 1911 and 1917. Both, though minor in and of themselves, were subsidiaries of powerful conglomerates in steel, shipping, mining, and commercial agriculture throughout the Japanese empire, which at this point included the following territories. So this is a weird map and it doesn't quite work, but the red part is, of course, you can see up there, that's sort of what's become the Japanese nation state. The shaded red area is the area that the Japanese obtained from Russia after the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and then parts of the pink, Korea, parts of Manchuria, and then Taiwan were areas that the Japanese empire had subsumed by the time we get to World War I. So by the time that I'm talking about the entry of these sugar companies, there already is a pretty vast kind of network of formerly colonial sort of industries and colonial processes. And so Okinawa is sort of an intermediary within this whole process. The goal of Okinawa's, Japanese sugar interests during this period was to stake their claim in a global industry that was suddenly open to new players as a result of the wartime collapse of Europe's beet sugar industry. They also wanted to gain a foothold in the vast markets of India and mainland China, which at the time were still dominated by the British and the Dutch. So they worked toward this goal by forming cartels, by lobbying the state for favorable tariffs, by directly engaging in irrigation and land reform projects, and laying rail and sea transport lines to reconfigure both colonial and semi-colonial spaces in order to facilitate the extraction of raw material cane. The place of Okinawa's sugar within this story, within the mountains of white fine sugar that awaited their transformation into caramel or milk chocolate at this time, even in Japan, markers of modernity, was quite minuscule when compared to the volume that was already being produced at a fraction of the cost in its former colony of Taiwan, or in Dutch-controlled Java, over which the Japanese had obtained kind of purchasing rights at this time. Still, large sugar capital built infrastructure and tried to transform Okinawa into another one of their sites of accumulation and extraction. As factory supervisor, Kabayama Junichi said in an article that he wrote for the August 5th, 1914 issue of the trade paper, Okinawa Jitsugyo Shinpo, the company's vision was to, quote, employ large numbers of workers who engaged in labor all day long. So this was their aspiration. And I'll show you a couple of photographs to see kind of the scale that we're talking about. So it's not that big. But this is a photograph of a factory, Nishihara factory, that a company called Tainansha, which would eventually become the monopoly sort of sugar capitalist in Okinawa, built immediately upon entering the prefecture. This is actually, sorry, that's a mistake. They didn't build it. They actually took it over from a prefecture kind of supported experimental kind of factory. So that's one. And then this is just an image of the routes that we see connecting Okinawa. And Okinawa here really is a stand-in for sugar, right? So all the sugar produced was sent from Naha Port in Okinawa to the southwestern part of Japan, port of Kagoshima, as well as Kobe, which is close to the kind of commercial center of Osaka, and then also to Taiwan. So these were the areas that these sort of large vessels, this one was conglomerate, was part of the Mitsui conglomerate, built in order to connect Okinawa's sugar production with the rest of the empire and with mainland Japan. And then this is an image, this is also kind of World War I era of Naha Port with sugar barrels awaiting their transportation to Kobe and then finally to Osaka. So Kabayama's plan to employ large numbers of workers who engage in labor all day long was much easier to articulate than to realize. The companies confronted a population of cultivators who'd been manufacturing brown sugar, who'd been manufacturing their own cane that they cultivated into brown sugar for generations as a result of the tribute kind of requirement. These families managed the challenging work conditions of sugar production by forming their own associations that were organized at sub-village levels called satogumi. And each sugar-producing village in the prefecture had approximately 8 of these satogumi, and each of these included an average of 17 families, so very small-scale production. And they were in charge of operating a communally owned sugar hut, for tending to the large kettles that boiled the cane juices, which were also communally owned, and for creating a work schedule that its members could agree upon. So in contrast to what you saw earlier, this would be, this is a photograph of a Taisho era, so mid-1910s era, sort of satogumi complex, right? So what you have at the top there is the so-called sugar hut where the cane juices are boiled. And then below that, those circular areas are where the cane, the harvested cane would have been crushed and turned into juices. So here's a closer up of that. And so if you can see the little boy crouching down there, that's where the cane would have been sort of sent into the grinders. That large sort of piece of wood would have been, the gears would have been turned by turning that around. Sometimes with, or a lot of times with the use of that horse, but sometimes through manual labor. So in addition to their communal manufacture of brown sugar, members of the Satogumi also had mutual labor exchange agreements called yuimaru with each other, and these were with between 5 to 8 families in order to complete subsidiary tasks like cutting and transporting cane to the sugar huts and also making sugar barrels. This arrangement was vital to the overall success of the Satogumi, or the Sugar Association, because as many of you may know, cane is a really sensitive plant that required cutting and transport in a really timely manner to protect the overall quality of the final product. These work relationships in turn also shaped a lot of the collective entertainment that villagers enjoyed during the busy season, like the village theater, that members of the association enjoyed the day after manufacturing was completed, and the sharing of meals that were made with food that was purchased on tab at the communal store. These sorts of arrangements endured despite the fact that some of these forms of village celebration, especially those that were officiated by women, and not just women, these were actually female shamans called Noro, who had quite a bit of power, both financial as well as kind of moral within the village, were prohibited around this time for being detrimental to both public morals as well as to household finances. So this idea that families, and especially women of families, could offer these Noro kind of exorbitant amounts of money to both officiate these kinds of festivals, but also, to sort of tell them, right, about sort of what direction they should take. These were considered to be extremely disastrous and the cause of the failure of the prefectural economy. And so both state elites as well as local elites kind of began to lament this practice quite a bit. Mainland sugar capital then faced the task of converting the rhythms, the pleasures, the calculations, and obligations that governed life to the time and sensibility of the large sugar mill. In fact, they faced numerous direct confrontations with brown sugar producers who organized a series of non-selling alliances between 1916 and 1921 in order to secure better terms for the cane that they did choose to submit to the factories that were operated by either the Okitai Seito or the Tainansha. And the one I'll talk about here is the first, which was organized in late 1916 by producers who lived kind of in the following regions. So we have Mawashi, Tomigusku, and Haibadu villages, which were sort of areas they were called procurement zones for the Tomigusku factory. So the idea is that all of these, the cane that was cultivated in these villages were close enough or were tied to agricultural roads, right? Or sort of light railway that could kind of get the cane quickly enough to these factories. But at this point, basically, the cultivators could decide whether they wanted to, convert their cane into brown sugar themselves through that earlier process, or they wanted to sort of transport that to the factory for money. So at the heart of the dispute with these non-selling alliances was the price at which sugar companies set brown sugar production costs. So it's really simple. So basically the price that factories paid cultivators for their cane was calculated by taking the average price of brown sugar on the Naha market during the 10 days prior to the designated date of submission, which the factory set, and subtracting the brown sugar production cost from this price. So it was to the supplier's advantage to negotiate the lowest possible figure at the bottom, while the company benefited from publishing the highest cost. So an article that appeared in the local newspaper called "The Resolution of the Dispute Over the Sale of Cane" reported the details of the negotiation. And according to this, alliance representatives held a meeting in order to determine a response to the company's refusal to budge from the figure of 2.1 yen per barrel. Members of the non-selling alliance insisted that the highest figure they could accept for this bottom part was 1.7 yen. So this meant that a 20% gap had to be bridged before alliance members would agree to supply their cane to the factory. And here, within sort of this bottom price, wages were the main point of contention in determining the brown sugar production cost and comprised over 30% of the total figure. So this was what the company set forth as the cost of production of brown sugar. So despite the fact that what would count as wages in the brown sugar production cost was not something that the sugar company actually paid out to cultivators, right, or something that affected the price of brown sugar on the market. They tried to hike up that figure as much as possible in order to justify paying a lower amount per cane. The members of the alliance saw through this attempt, this is by the Okitaiseto, to use this method of calculating the price of their labor power, when in fact much of the work that they did to manufacture brown sugar was done through mutual labor exchanges or by back-breaking uncompensated labor performed by members of farming households. So it's my contention that the non-selling alliance that erupted in those three regions in the winter of 1916 was not a simple dispute over the brown sugar production cost, but was primarily a battle over whether or not the wage form would be accepted as a legitimate method of mediating relations between human beings in communities where this relationship did not exist on a wide scale. And this is significant because if the company had been successful in pushing this method of calculation through, what Marx called the Code of Abstract Labor would have been extended to these communities. While this specific form of struggle faded in the mid-1920s, as the attention of Japanese sugar capital shifted to Taiwan, right, they thought, well, we can't really suppress the Okinawans because they are Japanese. We can inflict violence, right, more direct violence in Taiwan. That was the rationale. Their refusal to transform themselves into workers with nothing but their labor power to sell forced the state and capital to come up with alternative strategies of control, not least a new round of enclosures, the weakening of these collective labor arrangements, and the encouragement of migration to Japan's expanding sugar empire, which is where